So our second speaker today is Nessa Carson. So she received master's degrees in synthesis and catalysis from Oxford University and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She started out originally as a synthetic chemist for AMRI and then moved within the company to run the high-throughput automation facility for Eli Lilly, working across discovery, process chemistry, and then in high-throughput reaction optimization at Pfizer and then Syngenta. So most recently, Nessa moved to AstraZeneca, the early chemical development division in 2022 as the digital champion. She's focusing on digital transformation and making life easier for chemists. So I will stop presenting now, Nessa, and let you share your screen.
Great, thank you for the introduction. There we are. Can we see that?
Perfect. That looks great.
Cool, good stuff. All right, yeah, thank you so much. It was a really great introduction, and it's pretty cool to follow a talk from Lyndon. I thought that was really, really interesting. So yeah, actually our talks fit in quite well together, as you guys will probably see in just a minute. Yeah, so I've been asked to give a bit of an overview on how we use automation and data. I'm going to center on the pharmaceutical industry because that's where I'm working, but this is applicable to many other industries as well. So I saw that there's quite a broad audience here when I flick through the names. Some people I recognize, so hello. So I think I'm going to try and, if I have any examples, keep them simple so that they are hopefully more applicable to a broad group of people and experiences. I hope that will work out very well. But yeah, let's start with pharmaceuticals and how it all works, if my slide will advance, so it'll just slowly. So yeah, probably a lot of people have heard of the DMTA cycle: design, make, test, analyze. I guess I'll expand a bit more broadly on this, but this is the kind of cycle we're looking at, starting with research, moving into preclinical studies, clinical studies, regulation, launching a market, and then it's out there and patients will be able to hopefully take the drug if everything has worked out. So as you are advancing from not knowing what your drug is going to look like to very much knowing what you want your drug to look like and how you want to formulate it, and do you want it in a tablet and that sort of thing, you are going to need much greater quantities of the drug substance, the actual active pharmaceutical ingredients. You're going to need process understanding to be able to get there as we move from really small experiments into having to make say like 100 kilos or more as time goes on. We have, I guess, additional constraints on this. So AstraZeneca plans to be carbon negative across the entire value chain by 2030, which is a bit terrifying because that's 5 years away, and that's a really big ask. But we're very much getting there, so we're very much into sustainability. Plenty of other pharma companies are saying exactly the same thing. This kind of thing will require a significant time reduction going from discovery to launch. I mean, these things are not fast. It takes many years and hundreds of people to get a drug on the market. This is not an easy thing. It's not purely a chemical problem. It's not purely an engineering problem. It's many different things that come together to get us a drug out at the end. And if we don't have data, we cannot hit our goals. Let's say sustainability is a goal. It's one of the main goals. If we don't have the data, we don't know where we have been as a baseline. We don't know what we're doing now. We don't know where we should go even. We don't know what's realistic. So this is exactly the same as what Lyndon was saying about knowing the reaction conditions that went in. If we don't have those reaction conditions in our data set, we don't know where we have been. We don't know what we're doing now. We don't know where we should go. We just don't know. It's incredibly important that we have those in our data set. So I'm going to try and talk about how we can try and get those in there. So robots actually help us with all of this right the way through the cycle. They're not just for the early phases. Believe me, I work in early process chemistry now. Automation is completely relevant to process chemistry. That doesn't always, I guess, come across when people are not so familiar with how the robots work, but it's completely true. So when we look at the design, make, test, analyze cycle, this is something we think about in discovery chemistry particularly. And robots are helpful all the way through. So we can do parallel synthesis. Some people call that library synthesis. Using automation, so you're exploring the design space, you're filtering down, you're trying to get to the molecule that you want to continue with later on. In the make phase, we talk about high throughput reaction optimization. I'm going to focus my talk on that because I focus my career on that, and it's a pretty great space, and I definitely love being able to see what the advantages there are. In the test phase, so DMT, that's mostly biology, and the biologists are definitely using automation because they're doing so many experiments in assays all the time. And then when it comes to analysis, we need software automation as well as the chemist's intuition that come together and make the analysis work really well. So that's discovery. Over in development, we have some, again, additional needs. We need efficiency, we need sustainability, and we need to get the process understanding for the optimization and the scale up. Without those, we can't scale up effectively. We need to extract the best route. We'll have hundreds or thousands of possibilities. I genuinely mean that. You can have 1,000 possibilities for the routes you can possibly go when you consider all possible combinations. We need to be able to get those down without a chemist having to look through thousands of routes. They'd get very bored. And we also need to deal with statistical data, biological, chemical, human data, sometimes all in the same place. Generally not so much at the same time, but we need to find ways to go between these. And, you know, someone who's an expert in, let's say, clinical trial data may not be so much an expert in chemical data. We need to get those people together to make these data actually work. So when we're talking about high throughput experimentation, or HTE, I always want to share some myths in case anyone's not so aware of HTERO, high throughput experimentation, reaction optimization. This paper, well, it's a perspective in chem, I think is really quite good. It's only a few pages, maybe give it a read. So it gives you quite a nice feel about what the field is like. It's definitely not trying just everything you can think of or random conditions. So some of my colleagues call that the scattergun approach. It's definitely not that. There is maybe once in a blue moon, right, that you won't know what you want to do in an experiment and you just try and hit it with everything. That is so rare. Normally, this kind of experimentation is not like that. It's a very focused experiment that, you know, we understand what the space is like. We're doing clever things to try and figure out how to run our experiment. It's not particularly similar to the high throughput bioassays. So yes, we're using robots. Yes, we run things in batch in little well plates. Otherwise, not super similar, to be honest. Like, there's a lot of focus on the experimental design, which isn't like for the specific experiment, which I guess isn't as true in the case of biology, where you'll run the same kind of thing many, many times, and then the clever part is figuring out the biology that goes into it. Reaction optimization and library synthesis, those are different things. Library synthesis, you're making, say if I have a 96 well plate, library synthesis, I'll be making 96 compounds. Reaction optimization, I'll be making one compound 96 times and seeing what worked really well and how the other things that didn't work so well turned out. It's also definitely not unscalable, very, very applicable to process chemistry. So what are we actually doing here? We're doing things like improving the yields of tough reactions. We can explore alternative conditions. This includes things like green solvents is quite a common example. Say you've got a reaction that already works really well and you have to scale it up and you can't do it in something like dioxane because it's not so good for the environment. Can be enabling new reactions or trying to make them general so that they'll work across someone else doing library synthesis across the whole library. And it is pretty much always, it should always be, generating standardized data to inform future synthesis. Otherwise, you are throwing your data away. So let's take a look at how we actually run this. So differently to Lyndon, I'm going to talk about batch chemistry. I'm going to talk about the optimization that's my favorite to deal with, which is early reaction optimization. So in early reaction optimization, we nearly always use batch, and then we can move into flow later. This is because it's like really exploratory, and quite often we have entirely categorical variables. So there are no continuous variables like concentration or not so much in the way of different temperatures here. Categorical variables would be things like solvent or ligand, you know, that you can't necessarily put in order. And yeah, a lot of HTA actually doesn't move beyond this early design phase. So for example, if you work in drug discovery, you probably just want to make this molecule the one time, and then you're not thinking about making it again later. You don't care that much, so long as it works really well. You just need to make the molecule, that's it. So you can do an HTA plate to get to the stage where you can make the molecule. You don't then need to just optimize it to death. So this is something I have heard from discovery chemists. You do not need to try and get 99% yield. It doesn't matter. If you don't want 99% yield, stop at 30, you know? So what the lab generally looks like, if you want to get your stuff into a well plate like this, let's say we've designed our experiment. I need a solid dispenser that will dispense, let's say, ligands, maybe my starting material. I need a liquid dispenser, so that will dispense solvents, maybe some of the reagents. I then need to run the reaction. I probably need to heat it. I might need to cool it. I'll definitely need to stir it. I would really recommend stirring rather than shaking for a lot of chemistry reactions. I'll need to do some sort of analysis. Typically, this is LCMS, just like Lyndon said. And then I need to report back, and I need to report back to the humans, of course, because they need to know. I also need to report back to any kind of computational systems and data systems that we have, so that we can close the loop or be able to reuse those data later, basically. So a plate will look something like this. This is an example plate. I haven't run this exact plate ever. I always personally make a bespoke plate for every single reaction. I don't reuse designs. It's not the worst. If you want to reuse a design, though, go ahead. I'm not the design police. Here I've got 12 different ligands. I've got 3 different bases, 3 different solvents. I cut off on the base solvent combinations to make it fit into 96 because that just works really well. 96 is generally a good number, I find. So that's the kind of plate that will look like. And as you can see, it's all categorical variables. So they're all discrete. There are no continuous parameters here. So that's what goes into it. What comes out at the other end is a bunch of data. So we make a lot of data. Here there are 192 reactions. So each one of these circles represents a reaction. And each one of these has chromatograms associated with it that come out of our LCMS. So we've got the UV traces up here. We've got mass spec kind of traces that are targeted in some cases, and then the full mass spec trace. There's a lot of stuff going on here. We're going to need to distill this down because we can't show someone 192 multiplied by UV plus MS plus everything else that we know about the reaction. So we'll probably need to turn this into a slightly nicer looking table like this, at least to start with. So here's our process data. And we've got quite simple things like what's the retention time of our, let's say the blue peak here, how big is it, what's the percent area. Those are the kind of very simple things that we get out in the process data. Of course, each of these also that we know about has a name. So we know that that one is called product. We know that that one is called terphenol. It's probably an internal standard. These are kind of things that we start to get out. But this is data generation. This is what we get. This is the product. This is like the output of the experiments, because we're not really generating samples here. This isn't a library synthesis. To never say never, like I have occasionally purified samples from reaction optimization and got out a few milligrams that is good enough for a biological test. Most of the time you won't do that. You're generating data. If you're generating data and that's the entire product of your experiment, you're going to need to do it really well. So when we have these data that come out, of course, people most of the time, the vast majority of people do not want to see giant tables like this, bearing in mind that this has many, many more columns out to the right and many, many more rows down here. This is just a tiny little crop of the table. So we're going to need to turn them into insights somehow. And I find data visualization is a really great way to do this. Lyndon showed a bunch of really great data viz. I have a book chapter down here that's about data viz for high throughput experimentation. If you want to take a look at that, I don't know if you do. By the way, pie charts. I know a lot of people hate pie charts. I also hate pie charts when used incorrectly. And there are not that many times that you can use pie charts, I would say, correctly. I would say one of the times is in high throughput experimentation because you have a lot of data going on. So you get arrays of pie charts, which is just about the only time pie charts are useful. And we can see here that the yellow is our desired product in this case. So we look for stuff with a lot of yellow when we want a high yield. I will never present a single data viz, so not usually as an output here. I would present a whole bunch of different visualizations, bar charts, scatter graphs, stuff like that. And that's, I find, a really good way to represent categorical data because there's no inherent pattern to it. You need to find the trends and really seek them out and see what's going on that's really interesting in your experiments. Oh, I guess one other point I really need to make. Try not to, unless, sometimes there is a good reason for this, but most of the time in reaction optimization, you do not want to just look at your product or just your product and your starting material. You find really, really interesting things when you look at all the side products. So, for example, the side products in this list, that is where the interesting chemistry lies, or just some little hints on where to go next if you want to optimize in future. It's where your learning as a human experimenter comes from. Always take the side products, always just have a look at them. If you don't understand what every single one of them is, then, that's perfectly normal for a reaction, right? But try and figure out what's going on in there because you learn so much from this. This is why I don't normally recommend heat maps most of the time, at least for 96 well plate, because a heat map only shows you one thing, for example, the desired product yield. So that's part of the reason why I actually do recommend these pie chart arrays. So we have all this, we have our data, we're starting to get some insights out from this, or we're starting to at least have visualizations that a human can look at and try and figure out their own insights. And we're working towards the future. So our future labs, we're looking for really cool stuff. We're looking for really innovative stuff that's going to change the way that we make drugs. And these future labs, they need our data from the traditional labs. Otherwise, they can't happen. Like, we need data. And if we're collecting data, it needs to be good. It needs to be beautiful, readable, reusable, and it needs to make the data people happy. How we can do this, I think, and I would say this as a experimental chemist, but most digital transformation projects, when they don't go well, they don't go well because of human-based issues. They don't go well because of people issues. And actually, the way to get good data in the first place is to have processes and workflows that work really well for the chemists in the labs, whether they are data people or not. It doesn't really matter. Like, you have a whole variety, a whole spectrum of people in high throughput experimentation labs, some of whom just use data, because they have to. And some of whom really, really care a lot about the tiny little details of the data. So everyone cares about the data, even if they don't think they do. But they need things to work really well for them. So this is what we do. We automate the boring stuff. So there are 3 intellectual parts here in the batch high throughput experimentation. There's the plate design. We love the plate design. That's how we figure out what's going to even be in there in the first place. Reaction analysis. So I really recommend do not just fully automate this because you will lose those learnings about the side product a little bit unless you're doing, thousands of experiments at the same time. And of course, figuring out your lab setup in the first place. So let's make robots do the rest of this. So looking back at what I showed you before about the lab setup, we've got solid dispensing, liquid dispensing, or heating, cooling, agitating, analysis, then reporting and closing the loop back to talking to a computer so that it can do more stuff like really cool machine learning or whatever it is that we want it to do. When we think about the workflows here, Why are we actually thinking about the workflows? Well, the data chemists, or whoever it is who's going to be looking at the data, they want good data standards. That's going to be really important. Otherwise, they're going to either waste their time spending ages and ages cleaning the data, or they're just not going to be able to use it at all. For example, if the data aren't there, they're not going to be able to use them at all. They also want incorporation of fair metadata. So fair is this: findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. Concept that basically just means good data. Please look into that if you haven't seen this FAIR acronym before. And the metadata are just the data about the data. It can be as simple as who ran the experiment, when it was done, what this peak in the LCMS refers to, that kind of thing. All this could be considered metadata depending on the context. The automation chemists in the lab, they want a decrease in admin. If you're running, like I guess at the highest points of running experiments in my career, I was running 1,000 experiments every week in high throughput mode for a couple of years. And I did not want extra admin. I definitely did not want to physically have to label the peaks in every LCMS for every single one of them, because I can tell you I would not have been running 1,000 experiments a week at that point. It would have been a lot less. What the automation chemists also want is the incorporation of fair metadata. And they may not tell you this because they may not even know this or think about this themselves, but they do want it because it makes their lives so much easier. So where do these data actually go? What do we do with them? We need to think about this kind of question. We need to think about where the data come from, what happens, where do they go? And to do this and make it efficient, I like to make these process maps. So include every elementary step. I'll show you this properly in a sec. But imagine that the data flow were ideal. So what would your process look like ideally? And ideally, you're probably not going to move things from computer to computer, or you're probably not going to, I don't know, like go to a different building to do the next stage of your experiments, that kind of thing. So the data flow and the flow of physical samples, imagine these are ideal. Minimize manual interaction with computer systems, because you don't want to be going from plate, robot to computer back again all the time. It's just a bit, it makes the workflow inefficient from a human perspective. And automate all the possible data manipulation. If it's not possible, don't automate it. If it is possible, really try and find a way, even for the simple things, because without the simple things, you're not going to be able to have that flowing, efficient workflow that goes right the way through the entire process. So here's the kind of thing it can look like. I really need to stress this isn't a real process. This is just a kind of example of what it might look like. I think it's a pretty realistic example, to be fair, but it is just something I cooked up myself. So it might look like starting to communicate. You write your design plan, you talk to some kind of automated system, and it'll write you a bunch of scripts all at once. There's a reason it writes a bunch of well, not scripts, a bunch of files all at once. There's a reason it writes those all at once. That is because I don't want to keep running back to my computer system. See point 2. So I've written all of these different files, and then I can move to the lab. I can set my solid dispensing robot running. I can set my liquid dispenser running. When the solid dispenser is done, I can seal the plate, run the reaction, run my analysis, and I've got a file going in for that as well. Process my data. Only then am I going to touch a computer for the second time, or at least not one that's attached directly to a robot, because I can only do this at this point, because that's when I actually have my results that have come out of the LCMS. And then I go back to talking to humans and storing these data automatically in a system that closes the loop. So it looks a little bit like this, but it's basically a problem with just figure out the logic and work out how to do each step at a time. The more of this you can automate, the better. I don't think chemists, unless they absolutely have to, should even be thinking about this kind of thing. It should just happen for them. So I just want to finish off talking about data. It's easy to forget sometimes, but even like a single chromatogram that comes off your LCMS is pretty big. Like, it contains a lot of information, is what I mean by big here. So we've got our diode array detector, so that's what gives us our UV trace. It's running 20 hertz, 20 times a second, 1.2 nanometer resolution, all the way from like 200 to 400-ish nanometers. Maybe we've got some other detectors, an evaporative light scattering detector that's going 10 times a second. Got a mass spec, so that's got me another 3D trace here going at both in positive and negative 5 times a second, so that's 10 times a second in total. It adds up to a lot. And these are not, this raw data is not, I guess, obvious when you look at it. We need the human, or we need something, right, to process this, to make it understandable. But it's amazing, I think, when you think about just how much data is actually going in there. So without all the bells and whistles on, just the pure data itself is like 9.7 megs per chromatogram. It's like a gig per 96 sample plate. These numbers can vary wildly, but just as an example, there is actually quite a lot in there, considering that that is all just numbers stored in text pretty much. So I really, really want to emphasize this. Please stop throwing your data away. We don't know in advance which data are going to be useful. People do reuse even the most boring data in ways you didn't imagine. An example I always give is one time I was making an app for how people want to look up their NMR and LCMS data. And a question I had was, hey, what solvents should I put in this list and what order should I put them in? And it's how often people had used those solvents for NMR in this case. Or you might say, like, how often do we use this eluent on the LCMS? How often do we have to remake it as analysts? So it's those kind of questions. Even if you're making a calibration curve, those data are actually useful because it's an example of a time you used that eluent. So even boring stuff like a calibration curve can be reused, just not in the way that you maybe initially think. So please stop throwing your data away. As an example, most known transformations are only reported once. Even if you take out the ones that don't exist, most that don't really exist, that are incorrectly reported, they're only reported a few times. If this is your only example in your company of when you couple two obscure heterocycles together, and it probably will be if you're coupling two obscure heterocycles together, you don't want to lose that. You want to keep this so much. So yeah, user friendliness is basically what gets you all the way to adoption. I've found this so often. People interact with data and systems so differently when they are user friendly. I really do believe that we should try and make things automatic when we possibly can. Makes things better when you're interacting with systems, when you're analyzing your own or people's data, and when you're trying to understand exactly what's going on. So I just want to acknowledge my teams in early chemical development and across pharmaceutical sciences. It's a really cool department to be in, particularly Christoph and Parola. Thank you.